We are in chapter 21, and we're going to deal with the New Deal. The United States is in a Great Depression. We've talked about the reasons why, and we've talked about some things that have exacerbated this situation for the United States. Herbert Hoover was very unpopular during the election of 1932, and he was running against this man right here. The guy on the right, that's Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and there's Hoover on the left. Two very different men. Hoover, a Republican, we know what his hands-off approach or his laissez-faire approach to government is, and Roosevelt, a wealthy New York governor who was running for president in 1932. Roosevelt was the cousin to Theodore Roosevelt, and he had married Theodore Roosevelt's favorite cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt, who was also Franklin Roosevelt's fifth cousin. Roosevelt was a graduate of Harvard, and in 1921, he contracted polio. He was 39 years old, and polio is an infectious disease. It's a virus that affects muscles, usually muscles in the legs. And so Franklin Roosevelt was confined to a wheelchair for the rest of his life, or he could stand on his legs, but he would have to be moved, helped around with someone, usually his sons. One of his sons would help him move around. Now, this was concealed from the public. In this pre-television age, and the media knew not to take pictures and publish them in newspapers of Franklin Roosevelt, this being pushed around in a wheelchair. This was just common knowledge that the media honored and would not print those photographs. And so for many Americans, they had no idea that the president was confined to a wheelchair. Roosevelt was a very talented politician and a very talented communicator. He had what people call the common touch. He was, again, very wealthy, from a very wealthy family, very privileged New York family, but he could talk to common farmers. He could relate to them, and he became the hero of just ordinary citizens. Now, his approach to government was quite a bit different than Hoover's and the Republicans. He didn't pause at all when it came to trying new ideas and trying to get America out of this depression. He believed in what he called throwing off the dogmas of the old quiet past and trying something, anything, to improve the economy. Now, you remember progressivism. No need to write this down unless you didn't get it the first time. Remember that progressive movement that sought governmental action in solving problems? Well, this had a lot of influence. This movement had a lot of influence on Franklin Roosevelt, who was a young man during the progressive era. And he took a lot of those progressive, remember, Theodore Roosevelt, his cousin, was a progressive president. And so Franklin Roosevelt took a lot of, or several of Theodore Roosevelt's advisors and used them to advise him. The country was in such a bad state that this very important journalist named Walter Lippmann once said that the country was in such a state of confused desperation that it would have followed almost any leader anywhere he chose to do, or anywhere he chose to go. And so they were looking for something new, and they found something new in Franklin Roosevelt. And so in the election of 1932, Roosevelt won by a landslide. All the green states here on this map are states whose electors voted for Roosevelt, and all the peach-colored, pink-colored states up in the Northeast, those are the ones who voted for Herbert Hoover. And you could see this was a very lopsided election. All right. In a speech accepting the Democratic nomination in 1932, Roosevelt had promised a New Deal for Americans. And so this was known as his New Deal. This is his ambitious series of economic programs launched between 1933 and 1934, the first 2 years of his administration. And these were launched to combat the Great Depression. Now, when Roosevelt was running for the presidency and he was talking about this New Deal, he was very vague about what he meant by this. And that's because he had no blueprint. He didn't know exactly what he was planning on doing, but he knew that he was going to offer Americans a New Deal, and he knew that he was going to try a lot of different things. So when he was first inaugurated, he immediately went to work. In fact, in his inaugural address in 1933, he tried to reassure Americans. And this is the first step. I'm going to give you 3 steps that FDR took when he was first elected to try to solve this economic problem that the United States was in. And so in his inaugural address, he said, "This great nation will endure as it has endured. It will revive and it will prosper. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." You've no doubt heard this many times. And this is Roosevelt's attempt at trying to restore reassurance to the Americans, try to calm the Americans down and remind them that there's nothing to be afraid of here. We've worked through bad problems in the past. We will do it again this time. And so here he is trying to reassure Americans. They needed reassurance. The banking system was about to collapse. Already, 5,000 banks had closed. And just remember, those people who had deposited money in those banks, if they didn't get there before the bank closed, they lost their money. So the banks are hurting. Depositors are hurting. Yeah, this is a country that needs some reassurance. All right. And by the way, there's that picture that is a New York City bank there that's being run on by its depositors. These people are going to try to get their money out. All right, so Roosevelt is trying to reassure Americans. That's his first step. His second step was to save the financial system. He had to save the financial system. Banks, again, 5,000 had closed. So he pushed through Congress very quickly after his inauguration 2 very important bills. So let me mention both of them. Here's the first one, the Emergency Banking Relief Act of 1933. Okay, again, he's pushing this through Congress. So what this did was this closed the banks. He had what he called a banking holiday, that for 4 days, all U.S. banks were closed. And this happened, by the way, 2 days after his inauguration. So he's moving quickly. He closed the banks to try to calm everybody down, this banking holiday. And so what this Emergency Banking Relief Act did was it provided for the reopening of those banks, but the reopening under very strict conditions. Now, we're not going to get into the weeds there, but the second thing this Relief Act did was it took the U.S. off the gold standard. Let me explain this just a little bit. It took the U.S. off the gold standard. So most countries, including the U.S., were on the gold standard in 1932. So Roosevelt is taking the U.S. off the gold standard. So when you're on the gold standard, that means you as a nation have so much gold and you've got it stored somewhere, and you only print as much currency as you have gold. So if you have, say, $100 gold, the equivalent to $100, then that means you, as a nation, only print $100 in currency. You can't print more, and you don't print less. This is very good in some situations, but one thing it does not allow for is flexibility. And if you're in a depression, you need some flexibility. And so what Roosevelt wanted to do was to be able to print more currency than the U.S. had gold. And so he took the U.S. off the gold standard with this Emergency Banking Relief Act. So you see now we can print as much currency as we wanted to. There's a danger here. If you print too much currency, inflation can result, and you don't want that to happen. But what you want is the flexibility to put more to. You're injecting cash in the economy. Remember that vicious cycle, and the solution, the way to get out of that vicious cycle, inject cash. And so this is what Roosevelt wanted to do. So that's the Emergency Banking Relief Act. The second important bill that Roosevelt pushed through Congress was the GlassSteagall Act. The GlassSteagall Act. Now, this is something that benefits us today. This established the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, and it including some other banking reforms, some designed to control speculation. Remember, it's that stock market speculation that helped to get us in this Great Depression to begin with. Well, this Glass-Steagall Act was designed to help control some of that. We're not going to get into those details, but let me say something about the FDIC. So the FDIC insured the accounts of individual depositors who had their money in banks. So remember, if you had your money in a bank and that bank closed, you lost your money if you didn't get it out before the bank closed. Well, now the federal government is stepping in and saying, if you have up to $250,000, we, the federal government, will insure that money so that if your bank closes, the federal government will pay you whatever your deposits were. So here's the federal government getting in and rescuing the banks and restoring trust in those banks. So now let them close. We don't have to run on the banks anymore because the federal government will insure our deposits up to $250,000. Now, these two laws have just done two very important things. Obviously, they've rescued, number one, they've rescued the financial system from collapse. This is a big deal. And they've also, number two, increased the federal government's power over the financial system. Our federal government already, just a few days after the inauguration of Roosevelt, our federal government is already getting more power and more control. Okay, so the first step that FDR took, remember, is to reassure Americans. The second step FDR took was to save the financial system. He's just done that with a couple of these acts. The third step that FDR took was to bring relief to the unemployed by putting them to work. He wants to bring relief to the unemployed. Like Hoover, he feared giving money directly to people. No, very few people wanted to do this, and very few actually Americans wanted direct aid. So what FDR did was to use the government, and this is what Hoover would not do. This is where they differed. FDR wanted to use the government to create organizations that would give temporary jobs to the unemployment. They're not sending checks out to people who aren't working. The federal government's wanting to put people to work, and then they'll send them checks, paychecks. All right, so let me give you three examples of this organizations that the federal government was creating in order to put people to work. One is the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. This began operation in 1933. You see here a group of men at Yosemite. They are employed by the government. They're getting checks, wages from the government. These are unemployed. The people who were eligible for this were unemployed young men, and the jobs they're taking are jobs that are, for example, these right here, preserving forests or improving national parks. So these young men would go to these national parks or forests. They would live in barracks, kind of like the military, and they would do various jobs in these national parks. This would last until 1942. So the CCC began in 1933, shortly after Roosevelt's inauguration, and it would last until 1942. And over 3 million Americans, by the time it ended, had worked under the CCC. Another organization that employed Americans was the Public Works Administration, the PWA. The PWA lasted from 1933 until 1944. And what happened with the PWA was that the federal government worked with private construction firms to build things like schools and dams and roads and hospitals. So private construction firms were doing all that work, but the federal government was paying them. And so these construction firms were hiring people because they got government contracts. And so they hired Americans to work in construction. And then let me just give you a third organization, and that is the agricultural. Well, this is actually not an organization. It's an act, but it's going to do something to help farmers. It's the Agricultural Adjustment Act, the AAA, Agricultural Adjustment Act. I'm sorry I don't have slides for these. It started in 1933, and it would only last 3 years. I'll tell you in just a second why it only lasts until 1936. Again, this AAA was aimed at saving farmers. This was actually more, and the way it was going to do this was by controlling farm prices. So it's not about helping unemployment. It's about controlling farm prices and getting farmers the very best prices possible. And so this is an attempt to bring relief to America's farmers. Remember, they're struggling throughout the 1920s. And so what the AAA tried to do, one of the things, was to raise farm prices. And so in order to do this, it set production quotas on major crops. Crops that were already growing in 1933, corn, wheat, soybeans, things like that. They were destroyed, and that way there would be less, say, soybeans on the market, and so the price of soybeans would go up. Livestock was also destroyed. For example, in 1933, 6 million hogs were slaughtered and their carcasses discarded. That's in order to keep them off the market and so that hog prices, pork prices, would go up. And this is what the AAA was trying to do. It was basically paying farmers to produce less. Now, this had a negative result, and that was that landowners who had sharecroppers, think of those Southerners, lots of blacks and whites on as tenants on somebody else's land, farming their land as sharecroppers. Well, if you're a landowner, you're getting paid not to produce cotton or whatever, and so you don't need those people on your land, so you kick them off. And so a lot of sharecroppers in the 1930s moved to cities as a result of this. Now, the AAA was successful because prices rose. So these are some ways that the federal government is stepping in, and they're not sending relief checks to people. They're sending paychecks to people who they have working for the CCC, and they're also hiring private construction firms with the PWA, and then they're setting farm prices by setting quotas under the AAA. All this was done during FDR's first 3 months. This is a lot of work that got done in what's known as the 100 days of 1933, his first 3 months. This is one of the most creative periods in American governmental history. And the way he was able to do this was because Congress was on his side. Congress had a Democratic majority. And so they're passing these and other measures. They want to promote recovery as well. Never had the federal government, as a result of all this, never had the federal government grown so much. Now, what FDR has done is offered an alternative to that Republican Party's conservative approach. They were the orthodox party. They were the ones who wanted unregulated capitalism. FDR was offering an alternative to that. He's also offering an alternative to the communist approach of the Soviet Union. Remember, Americans were afraid of communists at this time. Remember that Red Scare in the around 1920. that didn't really go away. And so Americans were afraid of a socialist or communist takeover. FDR is offering an alternative to that because he also believes in a balanced budget. He doesn't want to run up a big government deficit. And he also believed in not giving aid as handouts to those in need. So he had some things in common with the Republicans, but he's offering an alternative to them on one extreme and offering an alternative to socialism on the other extreme. Now, let me say something about FDR. He was a skilled communicator, Calvin Coolidge had held regular press conferences, and he occasionally used the radio. Americans heard his voice. He was one of the first presidents who most Americans had heard his voice. So that was Calvin Coolidge's way of communicating with the public. Roosevelt, though, did something a little bit differently. He used the radio to bring his message directly into the homes of Americans. By the mid-1930s, over 2/3 of all American families owned radios, and Roosevelt knew this, and so he decided to use the radio on a regular basis in what he called his fireside chats. He liked to think of his audience as being just a few people sitting around a fireplace listening to him. And people tended to feel that when they were sitting around the fireplace listening to him on the radio, they felt that he was talking to them. He was, again, a very skilled communicator. Between 1933 and 1944, during some pretty dark days of America, of the Depression, and then later World War II, Roosevelt got on the radio about 30 times for these fireside chats. And what this did was it changed the relationship of the president with the people. The people began to kind of expect our leader, our president, to speak intimately with us. And this was really a bigger thing. This was really an experiment in communicating with the American people. By the way, presidents are constantly trying to figure out a better way to communicate with the American people. Right now, President Trump is using a form of communication that is fairly new within the last few years, social media. He's using Twitter to bypass the media and communicate directly with the public.